Hey, Happy New Year and welcome back to the Free Will Photos podcast. Wow, 2026, it came really quick. And now, at the time of recording, we're 3 days into it. And I really wanted to start the year off by expressing the importance of editing images. Now, editing images can take on many different shapes, from fine tuning a photo just to make it look a little bit more presentable, to completely compositing and going over the top with editing your images and making a fantasy looking type of photo. So in this podcast, I'm going to kind of peel back the onion on maybe some ideas and things that you can think of. Now, I'm never going to tell you what's right or what's wrong. That's for you to determine. And those are also very subjective because what's right for a wedding photographer may not be right for, let's say, a photojournalist or someone who's editing images that are supposed to depict a real story and scene in a documentary fashion that should be very, very lightly edited, if at all. And I think that's the reason why, I want to start this particular podcast episode because I've been looking through my Vero account, the people that I follow, and I have a mixture on my personal account of images that I completely over edited and some images that I didn't even really touch. It was just straight out of camera, either the JPEG out of camera or whatever it may be. And, I think 2026 is also going to be the year where I recommend shooting JPEG more. And I don't know if you're kind of like me where you have this fear of missing out that if you don't shoot in RAW, that you're going to lose the capability of editing in post. And I think it's okay to lose a little bit of that flexibility in post-production when you're getting it pretty much right in camera, and especially for those things where you're just documenting the day. Not every photo requires this above and beyond approach to editing. And that's kind of the idea of today's podcast. So I rambled on quite a bit there at the beginning and, hopefully that makes sense. But let's go ahead and start with like stage one of editing. And this really comes down to those people who are photojournalists or someone who has to depict a scene in its natural form, and you don't want to go over the top. Stage one editing really just includes maybe brightening up some of the exposure, because if it's too dark, then no one understands it. Or maybe it's pulling back on the exposure because if it's too bright, then people won't understand it. So you're honestly just making corrective adjustments that are more true and accurate to the day. Now, I know a lot of photojournalists, and I shouldn't say a lot. I know a handful. I know like 3, but it feels like a lot. And based off of what I've gotten from them when I've had these discussions, they've told me that they prefer to shoot in JPEG most of the time because they need to get their images off to the editor. And when I say an editor, I mean like the person putting the publication that they're shooting for together. Now, I know one of the photojournalists that I'm thinking of. So the way that he works is he puts all of his images into a blog. So, and he takes care of them, but his blog is supposed to be more like journalistic of events that are happening. So that's the reason why he shoots in RAW. He has a little bit more liberty to edit, but he tries not to get too creative because he wants the things that he's articulating in his blog or in his articles to be a little bit more natural and realistic to the things that are happening on the day. Now, the next thing that you may do as a photojournalist, and if you're a photojournalist, you already know, so you're probably not like one of those people who are like, Chris, thanks, bro, but I got this. But really, it's for the people who may not be familiar with photojournalism and the level of editing. But there are a lot of people who will take the same approach to photojournalistic editing in their post-production process. And that's kind of who I'm targeting this particular message at. All right. So with that out of the way, corrective edits, adjusting exposure to make it either brighter or darker based off of what makes sense for the scene that you are photographing. You may even do white balance or color corrections, especially if something was shot in the incorrect white balance and it doesn't depict the scene properly. So just think of this as correction to whatever was happening on the day in the scene, and you just want to make sure that it makes sense to the viewer. So that's level 1 editing, and you may even do some cropping, because I know that, there's some people out there who think, well, you shouldn't crop, you should just get closer. But for photojournalism, sometimes you just can't get closer to the action or to the thing that you are photographing. And so you may need to crop. And, some photojournalists, they get more creative with the way that they shoot the subject, so then they don't have to worry about cropping, because they'll use out of focus elements to hide the ugly street corner sign or something like that. Whatever it may be, doesn't really matter. All I'm saying is you may want to crop. And I haven't heard of too many people saying that cropping is a bad thing in photojournalism, but you let me know down in the comment section if you're watching this over on YouTube. And if you're not, then, just come over to YouTube and comment on this particular video and let me know. So level 1, you're making corrections. Level 2, you're going to get a little bit more, in depth with adding in masks and really taking hold of the viewer's eye. Wherever you want the viewer to come and pay attention to in the image, and it may not even be the way that it looked on the day that you photographed it, but this could come into play as maybe you're darkening the bottom right corner that may have been really bright when you actually photographed it because the sun was hitting that area, but you don't want anyone to pay attention to the bottom right of the frame. But by cropping it, you lose some of the context of the overall scene and the message that you're trying to convey. So what you're doing here is you're masking the main subject, so that way the subject looks a little bit brighter. You're darkening down the other areas that don't really matter to the subject. You may even desaturate those areas to make them less interesting. You can do different texture type of separations, because essentially in photography, there's 3 ways of separating your subject from everything else. The first one is with the tonality or the brightness. Things that are brighter in an image, they're going to be seen first by the viewer than things that are darker. That's one that I think many people are aware of. The second one is going to be texture. If something has a lot of texture and everything else in the frame has less texture, you're going to pay attention to it. And if you couple that with the thing that's brighter than everything and has more texture, it's going to stand out in your image that much more. And then the last one, or, not necessarily the last, but the third one would be color. Things that are more saturated will stand out than things that are less saturated. Unless, of course, that thing that's less saturated is brighter. And that's the reason why you would darken down areas and desaturate them, because you don't want the viewer to spend much time looking at that area of the frame. So for your subjects, maybe that's something that you're going to do. For everything else in your image, maybe you want to desaturate it, right? So when you combine all 3 of these elements to separate your subject from everything else that's happening in the photo, it makes it a little bit easier for the viewer to pay attention. And this could be done very, very abruptly, where it's very aggressive and very obvious that you did it. And it could also be done very subtly. It could be done in a way where no one even knows that you did it. So now that we understand a little bit about how you can separate, so level 1, level 2, we've taken care of those. Then we can go into level 3 of, the photo editing journey. And this is really where you start to go above and beyond. You may do a background replacement. You're going to do the other two things, or the other two levels, where you're correcting areas. You're also drawing the viewer's eye. And again, level two can be more aggressive and more assertive. So you could be very subtle with how you draw the viewer's eye, or you could literally put a vignette all the way around your image and then make everyone focus right in on your primary subject. There's so many different ways of doing this. I won't list them all, but you could, there's a range, so to speak. But level three is when you are almost branching into the fantasy of what you would love to have the image had looked like, or the fantasy of what the image would have looked like if you could like control every aspect. And this is where you start removing backgrounds. You may replace a sky. You're going to add in colors that did not exist and don't naturally exist in that particular location. So if it's a sunset and you want the purples to like really be extremely vibrant because you want those colors to punch through, even though that's not what it looked like and they probably weren't even there to begin with, you can add in purples with color grading and masking, and you could just go all over the place. The sky and your imagination is truly the limit here. And for the people who are doing these things, you know why you're doing it, and you're doing it very intentionally, or at least I hope you're doing it intentionally, because no one replaces a sky by accident. And very rarely will you see someone say, well, I just accidentally threw a color into my image that didn't exist there before. Typically, you will do that by default, or with very deep intentions and thought behind it. Because the reason you want to infuse purple, or maybe more magenta, or maybe even a color that's completely opposite, green, right? You want to throw a little bit of green or dark blue into the mix that don't really exist there. And you're doing that to really draw the viewer's emotion to the image. Because when you start doing photos like this, you typically are trying to convey two things. And one is going to be the visual aesthetic of what the image looks like. But the second one is going to be the emotion that you want the viewer to have when they're looking at it. And this is one of those things called visual voice. And the message that you're trying to articulate into the image, or through the image that you're trying to share with the viewer, that's called the visual voice. This is very important and something that I don't talk about often, but it goes a long, long way when you start editing your photos and you start manipulating things, at least at level three. There's visual voice in level one and level two, but those happen at the moment of capture in most cases. Level two, you may put a little bit more of your visual voice in there, message-wise, as you start to darken down areas that weren't naturally dark. However, level three, you are taking complete control over the message that you're sending. You may even blur things that weren't there. You start erasing things that were there. So if there was a bunch of branches around this bird, but you want to focus the attention on the bird and those branches are distracting, you may start to remove those in a number of ways, erasing all of the evidence that there were even branches there to begin with. There's so many ways that you can articulate your visual voice in photography and photo editing that I'm not going to cover them all here, but that's something you should be aware of and that you should at least pay attention to, because every photo tells a story. Even if you don't intentionally tell a story and you think that you're just pushing the shutter button and making something beautiful, that image is still telling a story. And the reason you want to edit your photos, coming all the way full circle to the editing aspect, is because you want that story to come through. You want that story to make sense. You want that story to be very evident to the person who's viewing your image. And that's why you choose whichever level that you need to edit. Every photo tells a story, and you get to tell the story. That's the beauty of photography. Even the things that you think you may not have any influence over telling the story, every photo that you take, that you create, that you capture, it comes with your vision. No one else has the vision. No one else is there, framing up your camera. And if they are, then that's a different discussion, because I'm sure there are some industries where people will frame up your camera for you and you just have to push the button, which I don't know, that kind of defeats the point. I digress from there. But if you are the person that's viewing the situation, let's say you're at a football game, you get to tell the story of that game. They're, first down and they're getting ready to make the first play of the game against the highest stakes game in the season. What image are you capturing to tell that story in that moment? Are you photographing the coach who's probably dialed in? Are you photographing the quarterback? Or are you looking towards the fans to see what their thoughts are? Or better yet, or not thoughts, or emotions that they're expressing. Or better yet, are you going into the final seconds of the game and it's coming down to this one play? Where are you pointing your camera to tell that story? Because the final seconds of any game, especially a high stakes game or a game that's really close, it matters where you point that camera. And that's the visual story and the visual voice that you get to choose when you're creating your images. Heck, maybe you're looking at the primary referee, the main official, the one who's making all the calls. Maybe on the last play of the game, you're looking at him or her to figure out what the heck call they're going to make, especially if notoriously that person had been making calls all throughout the game that were either good or bad. You want to capture the look in their eye as the final seconds tick away from the clock. That's the visual story that you're trying to convey. But what voice are you going to have with that image? And the images that are on your SD card, right? And this is the beauty. This kind of goes beyond just editing the photo. But when you photograph something, it goes onto the SD card or whatever your capture card is on your camera. No one has seen those images yet, unless you're transferring over a fire FTP protocol or something like that, file transfer protocol. Well, no one else is seeing these images. And so what that means is you get to choose the photo that goes along with the narrative of what actually happened. And when you go into the editing space, whatever software you choose to use, that could be Lightroom, Photoshop, Affinity, Capture One. I'll stop naming photo software there because it doesn't matter. Because when you get into the editing space, whichever photo editor you choose to use, you have to make the choice of what story you want to tell. And that's when you go and find the image that you want to edit, and then you go to work. And if you're into photojournalism, then you're probably sending in a series of images, at least 5, to tell the whole story. And so based off of, what you are also putting with your text, if you're telling the story of a referee who called a bad game, you're probably going to have some images that go along with that narrative. Or maybe you're going to tell the story of the hometown quarterback that won the championship. And so you're probably going to have images of that person celebrating, or of that person making the tough decision in the game to execute something, or whatever goes along with the narrative. Now, I use sports in this example because I think that, it's just easy to follow along with what happens in sports and how people are, uh, always telling a story in sports. That's the only reason why I use sports. So, what is the visual voice that your images are supposed to convey? And then how do you edit? How do you make deliberate decisions to get that voice into all of your images? That is the whole purpose of what you're doing when you edit images. So hopefully that was helpful. I know that I went on a little bit of a rant and all over the place. It's just kind of how my mind thinks. And I also didn't have any notes for this particular episode of the podcast. I just had a thought and I wanted to share it with you. So please don't hold that against me too much. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you're watching this over on YouTube, go ahead and leave a comment. What level of editing do you go into? Level 1, which is just basic editing, cropping, and light exposure adjustments, stuff like that. Level 2, you're getting a little bit more particular about directing the viewer's eye into the main subject, the primary subject, and that has a range of how far or how little you will actually go. And then level 3, you're just going completely into artistic mode. You are manipulating every single aspect of the image and making the image what you want it to be, because the visual voice that you want to share with the world when you share this image, you want it to be received and heard loud and clear. So you're just going overboard. I want to know which level you like to edit at. I personally edit in between a 2 and a 3 on pretty much all of my images, but most of the images that I share are usually the level 3 ones where I've manipulated a lot further. And so that's kind of the goal for 2026 for me, is to edit less and do more subtle editing. So I want to lean more towards level 1 and level 2. And that's why I mentioned at the top of the show that I was going to start transitioning into shooting JPEGs in 2026. And I'll make a whole episode about that later. But I think that shooting JPEGs is going to be a huge improvement over a lot of my workflow, because it's going to help me get more intimate with my camera settings and be more present in the moment with the capturing of whatever it is that I'm photographing. So you let me know what your thoughts are on that, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to stop waffling or rambling on. Until next time, I want you to stay inspired and keep creating. Peace.